Great. Well, nice to see you all. Thank you. Nice to see some old friends here. There's Ian. Is that Ian? No, that's not Ian. No. Some faces are hard to recognise. I promised myself I wouldn't take nearly as much time as they said on the invitation, so don't panic. But I will have to move at a fair old lick to get through what I want to say. Frei Otto, clearly a lot of people know about Frei Otto, and they want to know more. I haven't seen this film either. I want to know more. I want to see what they say about him. It turns out, when I look back, that he was really quite important to my career, and that's why I feel, I want everybody to celebrate his life and his work. And I rather wanted Michael Dixon, who was kind of my boss for quite a long time working at Buro Happold, to come and do this instead of me. But unfortunately, he's a very busy retired man, so he wasn't able to. So I will do it. But just to position myself, I first knew Frei when I was, or met Frei when I was about 21, 22 probably. So I was the young kid kind of looking up at the guy. And I wouldn't want to claim to have been, bosom buddies or anything like that. But the effect that the work that I did in the early stage of my career has had on me, and the way things shaped up and the way I see structural engineering, is really significant. It's certainly significant for me, and I think it's nice to reflect on that. So this is a slightly personal, well, it is a very personal view of my, it's a bit like that One Week with Marilyn. Have you seen that film? It's quite a good film. This is my 3 years with Frei or something like that. But I don't think there was any heavy petting involved. But, not that I knew about. So, that was a dangerous joke, wasn't it? So, I thought I like this slide because this is it. This is what it was about. Frei got. This is none of these are Frei. I think that's Ted over there. I think that's Michael Dixon over here. I think this is the Canadian architect, either Sprinkle, Sprankle, or Sprague. I never quite remember. I expect David will remember who it was. But they're beavering away, absolutely fanatically precise measuring and modelling of something that's such an exciting building. They'll spend their nights and their nights and their nights doing this in a way we now press a button and think it's done it for us. So that sense of inspired by Frei Otto to have that focus, have that excitement about what you're doing. I was really excited when I saw that Norman Foster is also a fan, as a minimum a fan. You hopefully will read that. His extraordinary sequence of work altered the nature of architectural form in the 20th century when he was working. But now his environmentalism, his intelligence, foresight have established the defining architectural mentality, really good words, for the 21st century. And I kind of think that's why you're all here. There is a sense that what he was saying in the last century and through his life, in what he did and what he inspired other people to do, does form now a much more fundamental part of our thinking for the future. Whether we're reflecting it nearly enough in our engineering and our architecture, I would probably say I don't think we are, but perhaps we can start to see things move forward. And I've always, once I started thinking about these things and had seen what Frei was doing, I kind of place him in this kind of category, this category of maverick. You're not quite sure whether they're architects or engineers, but they have a passion, they have a philosophy of how things should be, a very special, personally developed philosophy of how things should be. And I think Frei fits very well into that category. I decided I didn't want that one there, but it stayed there. And so, Gaudi saw nature as a driver. He wanted to repeat the kind of forms that he saw there out in the field, that he saw in nature, and he found ways through modelling of doing that kind of thing. But Buckminster Fuller in a similar way, but when I read more about him, and I'm sure many of you know much more than I do, but with his architecture, with his kind of technical approach to architecture, came a whole philosophy of how you should live your life and how we should marshal the materials of the world. A lot more than just an architect, an architecture, engineer, philosopher, inspirer, as I was calling it here. And I think the same very much with Frei. And I love the fact, I soon learnt that whilst we engineers tended to think Frei was an architect and he needed engineers to help him, architects tended to think he was an engineer. and that they were the architects and they were working with this technical advisor, because he bridged that gap between, is it technology, is it architecture? And of course it's both. It's creating a form, an inspired building out of forces flow, minimum material, and so on, a sort of engineering-driven architecture. And the philosophy that many of you may know came out of a reaction against the heavy anti-human architecture and attitude he'd seen through the war, which he grew up in, and wanting to discover something fresh and new, and being inspired by nature, just like Gaudi and Buckminster Fuller, and on a different scale. He felt that nature would show us the way to get an architecture that harmonized with people. And I really think that's what he did. And I think that's why that message is so fresh now, which is where when I start talking about that, you'll know we're getting to the end. So that's a change of words. He was a son of a sculptor, so there was that sense of form and shape and asking the questions why. A Christian name, a first name, Frei, was, I think, rather clever. So he had that sort of, and brought that freedom to everything he did, his fresh approach. So this idea of looking at nature, looking at forms of nature, how do they use their materials, marshal their materials efficiently? How do they turn that into forms with least material? And how do we then translate those forms into buildings? And how have we been doing these things over hundreds and hundreds of years in the past, using local materials, available materials, and what forms come out of that? So that approach, looking at nature, gave him an approach to architecture and engineering. And he was out there seeking inspiration shortly after the war. And I had a little look back at the history of how things developed. And it was really that, as I said, a philosophy about how to live as well as how to build, which he also went and built his own home, and in that created the spaces that now a lot of people seek, this kind of, is it outdoors, is it indoor space, at one with nature, at one with the cold in the winter and the warm in the summer, but still at the same time a sort of natural buffer between the extremes of outdoors and indoors. And so he lived what he spoke and taught. But in those very early days, in the 50s, he was learning from the masters around him about the use of tension and how that could be modeled. Very simple model here of soap films, and fascinated in a kind of Germanic way, I think, about how do you link everything together? How do you categorize? I mean, I think they must be fantastic museum curators, because they want to kind of be able to map the flow of everything, the flow of nature, and different forms and how they relate to each other. So there was quite a sort of, not quite academic streak, but a streak in him. But it wasn't a random kind of creation, very much wanting to understand a process, understanding what was at the core of his thinking. And that, I think it helped a great deal when, and I don't know the full history of this, but when he was funded by the government and was able to set up his Institute for Lightweight Structures back in '64. And it was actually my visit to that institute back in the mid-70s where I first met him. But a very inspiring place to go to, a place in the woods which looks like something you've never seen before, and then you're told that it's a sample piece. It's a piece of the roof of the Montreal EXPO pavilion, and then I learnt that he was such a generous man. I was a student. Being a bit of a nuisance, saying, can you please introduce me to people I should meet around Europe and around Germany, etc., etc. And he's very generous with his time, and I think this shows, in this slide here with Frei, the sort of middle left, you always see these photographs where there's, maybe they're ganging together, especially to get in the photograph, but this sense, I always feel, you see a lot of these shots where, because of the technique in those days in the 60s and 70s of not a screen where one person sits in front, but this shared experience of the physical model quite complicated. It needed a lot of thought. It wasn't something you could just get Mr. Model Maker, Mrs. Model Maker to go off and do and bring you in a week's time. It was a crafted thing by experts, engineers, and people who were kind of inventing methods. Is it better if we put the spring in this way or that way? How stiff does the spring need to be? But finding, through these forms, trying to emulate modeling methods which would equilibrate forces. So they couldn't be done. They certainly couldn't be the sort of things that we see too many of now, the sort of 3D photocopying sand models, which don't tell you anything about materials. They don't have the force flow in them that's anything to do with reality. They just sit there like dumb objects. This was very much active engineering meets architecture modeling. And out of this really hard graft and focus come the most amazing forms, but all driven by the flow of forces, by how do I get a flow of tension from the masthead out to points in the ground. And then you discover the most beautiful forms that they make. So Montreal Expo was really one of the major starting point, really, that people really started to notice Frei's thinking, but always collaborating with architects. So this is where he came as this engineer architect who helped inspire and encourage architects to, if you like, feet on the ground architects who knew where to put the front door and knew how to, whether it needed catering here or catering there, who could make a whole thing out of it. Working with Frei, their architecture suddenly took off. But then he needed to work with some engineers like ARCHETYPAL or Buro Happold or GUTBROD, or others in Germany sometimes, who would make the whole package. So Montreal, really quite an astounding piece of work, and I'm sure it'll be shown in the film. Munich Olympics following on, more modelling, even more complicated, more precise, particularly difficult when the local authorities required it to conform with, as I understand it, to conform with kind of big building regulations and not to deflect more than a few millimeters on a building that clearly wants to deflect a lot more. It's interesting whether they couldn't have defined this as a suspension bridge or something and say, don't think of it as a building. But the most beautiful, outstanding stuff coming out really quite early in Frei's career, which I always think is quite remarkable. From a personal point of view, I have to bring in the Ted Happold factor. He's an ex-president. I think, was he a gold medalist over there? Yeah, so he's obviously, his spirit is here, or etched in the woodwork as well. And it was really meeting Ted that meant that I got to meet Frei, and he'd made friends with Frei, I don't know, 6 or 7 years before I met Ted, and had started doing some really interesting things. Apparently the story is that he met Ted at an airport at Mecca. No, probably not. Possibly at Riyadh airport. But anyway, they were both doing the same competition, but for different sites, if that makes sense. And Frei was looking for an engineer. Ted, working at ARCHETYPAL, was already an engineer on one of these buildings, a conference center. And Frei was looking for an engineer for another, this one in Mecca. Completely different kettle of fish, single span cable net, single curvature cable net, needed a lot of heavy concrete to weigh it down, and was struggling to find an architect who didn't just, an engineer who didn't just run away and say, well, we've never done anything like that, really not interested, and it can't comply with the DIN codes or anything like that, so thank you very much. But Ted had a habit of saying, chuckling probably, and saying, yeah, sure, we'll do that. He's got the whole strength of ARCHETYPAL behind him, and he's got a fantastic team with Ian Liddell and Michael Dixon, so we'll crack that one. And they did, they built it. Never got to see it, but of course, being in Mecca, they were not of the right persuasion, so they missed out. And out of that relationship, built in the very early 70s, other work started to flow, and this is where I first came in, and they were working at ARCHETYPAL as a team, Structures 3, and had been asked by Frei to do another project, the Mannheim lattice shell, where I believe they already had engineers. They were working with local architects, and they kind of gave up. This was going to, this was too thin. This crazy architect engineer who keeps saying, no, it will work, and they had no way of finding out whether it would or not. So went to Ted, can you help? And Ted, not knowing whether he could or not really, said, yeah, sure, and set the team at ARCHETYPAL working away on it. And it was a lot, as always, of modelling, but of course you're not seeing the tension structure modelling that we've seen for those tension structures. This is a shell, a compression structure, So it's much in the Gaudi spirit of things. You could see there the upside-down hanging chain model like Gaudi would use, and that defines the funicular form, as I'm sure many of you here know all of this stuff. My job, you see, this is where I come in. If you see the bottom left slide, was making this Perspex model, which was capable of carrying compression and bending as it happens, and then hanging nails on it. Those near the front might just about perceive the nails, and testing it for buckling. No computer modeling really up to the job at that stage, so physical modeling to test whether this very thin timber lattice shell of a shape and a scale that nobody had ever done before would buckle or not. And yeah, I managed to prove it would buckle, and out of which they decided, not surprisingly, I'm sure any engineer here, it wouldn't be surprised, but it's quite hard to see it, that we did indeed have to include, yes, it's very hard to see, as well as the two-way lattice, we couldn't tighten those nuts hard enough with our spring washers to stop the rotation of the nodes. So there are diagonal cables, almost invisible, to triangulate the lattice into a shell. But that relationship now built up with the Happold-Frei relationship is really what I can talk about and show you just a few slides of what that meant for me. Ted went off, while at ARCHETYPAL they were working on this much bigger project which Rolf GUTBROD, the architect, had won for a gigantic parliamentary building, King's offices in Riyadh. Didn't get built, probably for no surprise for the political students in the room, and upside-down hanging models, creating those most amazing forms of potential shell structures. And my job was there again, Perspex models, hanging nails, listening to the radio and having a great time, back in the summer of '76, as it happens. So that relationship, I think, was really important. I think at that point, that relationship between Ted Happold and Frei was probably the strongest engineering support which he really needed to carry through some of his dreams. Ted went off and decided he wanted to go to Bath University, become a professor, so he set up Buro Happold at that point, which was a motley crew of people. They're a little bit more porky out there than they were when they first started the show, but kind of engineers on a mission, as I said there. And I thought what was interesting is, I hadn't realized at the time, but Ted immediately wanted to do what Frei had done, set up an institute for lightweight structures up at Bath University. And I didn't realize that that's what he'd drawn me into, so he said, come and join me up there. And we played around with air-supported structures, research on air-supported structures. That ought to be a good way of getting to the fundamentals of what makes a tension structure tick. And of course, air-supported structures do have a very exciting potential. They have a very exciting origin. And they can make some pretty little buildings. They can make some pretty little tents like Pink Floyd. And in those very, very early days, we were just playing with stocking models and pushing and pulling and making shapes, cutting patterns. Even here in these days, towards the late 70s, generally speaking, cutting patterns coming by measuring the model. And so you see, a lot of this stuff starting to evolve. So this relationship, I think, helped Frei, with that engineering support, deliver, I would say quite quietly. I mean, often I don't think he's recognized for some of these very elegant, very productive buildings. Very, they did their job. And they actually woke people up to some new forms in the desert. As you can see here, the Jeddah Sports Centre. Nobody had ever seen anything like that. I'm not sure if they wanted to ever again, but it was certainly going to wake people up. It's very, very elegant without its clothes on, of course. It's sometimes a problem when you have to keep the weather out. And so these, these relationships, always trying to put up there the kind of core architect who then brings in Frei and says, I want to do something really exciting, help me. Let's use your way of looking at the world to help this be exciting. So the aviary in Munich, which spread into other aviaries. And again, further model studies. So my luck was my coming to those moments with Frei were often around modeling like this. How the heck do you get the forces out of a two-way mesh of woven wire up to a point without the wire going, mangling and distorting all over the place? How do you keep it in balance and translate these forces into the radial forces successfully and let it modulate and move under loads. And I remember the debate about would it need to be designed for snow loads, and there was quite a strong vote for no, it doesn't need to be designed for snow loads, because it would all go straight through the mesh, but someone cleverer than that worked out that if it was a very cold mesh and so on, that it would sort of stick and build ice, and then it could build up. And almost it's usually the first winter. I don't know, many of the engineers in the room will know this. It's almost as soon as you build it, it gets the 1 in 100-year load or something, so it's never worth skimping on it. And so we played around with all sorts of things. And I suppose here the influence going worldwide, this was a project in, I'm going to get this wrong, in the States, but I think it might have been a Canadian architect. But people were coming from all around the world to look to Frei for help, and then Frei coming to Ted Happold to get that help. And even with Canadian architects looking at something that he'd looked at with Arab previously, covering a giant community in the Arctic, in this case, not quite the Arctic, but 58 degrees north in Alberta, a pretty harsh climate. And this idea of, I found really interesting, and I think is significant about Frei, when you look at his ability to build in these harsh climates, this idea, I think, of the building as a skin and the skin as a climate moderator, I think started to kind of give a different sense to architecture. And it's almost like not architecture for its own sake, it's architecture for what it can do for the people, the creating of the oasis garden, the creating of these sheltered spaces away from the sun, and yet somehow not imposing themselves heavily on you. Although having said that, of course, perfectly happy to create a quite robust core to all of this. And I think that combination that he achieved, obviously with others, with OMRANIA, the architects in this case, is one of his masterpieces, and should be seen alongside something like the Munich Olympic Stadium, and I'm sure David would agree, having worked on it. And very, very beautiful space that he was creating. I think this sense that he wasn't just about the buildings and the technology of the buildings. I think these start to show that there was always that element that he was absolutely driving for, the effect that these shelters, these spaces would have on people, the inspirational effect on people. And in the Medina Mosque, I don't have a video here, but the opening and closing of these umbrella roofs, very quite an emotional thing to see these sorts of things happen. And then the use of green timber over in the UK, finally seeing more of Frei in the UK, working with ABK, Richard Burton in particular, with Ted Cullen at the Wealdon Downland Museum. And to some degree, this was us helping make a marriage between Frei Otto and UK architects, Shuguru Bang. So that brings me, really, that's the sort of journey that I was seeing. I was kind of observing this as a relatively young kid, probably making, a teenager making models and testing things and so on. What did it do? What did it do for me? And you have to kind of do it and then look back at it, and you realize so much of what I've done as an engineer has got this kind of voice of Frei in the background, even though I was too modest and shy really to ring him up. And anyway, I was working with other architects who didn't particularly want to get involved with other people like that. So crazy, awful things like this very sort of hippie-inspired, late hippie-inspired object, but inflated bubbles, shameless. Cable nets. I got the chance of doing cable net structure in Hong Kong, very much inspired by that confidence that we'd built up with cable nets, the ability to analyze them and use them. Although Frei wasn't involved in this, he'd allowed us to develop that confidence to do stuff like this, which I won't dwell on. The imagination building, again, Frei wasn't there whispering in Ron Heron's ear, but I think Frei had set a scene where people saw the possibilities of using membranes. And one of my joys with this one, apart from working with John Randall, was that it actually brought it into London. It brought it into a kind of adult context of an headquarters building. And it's still there, and I think it's still almost certainly delighting a lot of people every day as they cross the atrium. I hope so. Do say yes. Thank you. And working, I found myself, is it strangely? I don't know, but working with Norman Foster, it started really with the Great Court. And I think, I'm not quite sure whether it was luck or destiny or just I'm making it all up. But when I started working with Norman, I thought it was going to be all about rational geometries. It was all going to be about straight lines. You know, he'd not long before I started working there done the Nîmes, whatever the real name is, but the pavilion at Nîmes, and it was all about straight lines and everything. So when we did the competition for the British Museum, it was all about a single curve to cut out of a sphere, plopped on, and a two-way grid, nice, strong, diagonal grid. And that won the competition, so it kind of looked like that's what we would build. And that seemed very, very Foster's, if I may say that, at that point. But it wasn't. Turns out it wasn't. And that's why I was so delighted to see that quote that he gave, because there clearly is an empathy between him and nature and what Frei Otto was doing. He sees the value in it. And so after a very long time of looking for something more than we were able to do with that simple geometry, it became clear that the only way we were going to achieve what Norman wanted in lightness was to go into a much more complicated bubble form, if you like. And I used this shot of the British Museum just to show what a sort of inflated bubble form it really is. You just imagine pumping up the air inside the Great Court and getting that form. Of course, I have to say that had we just done that and done a soap film and pumped up even pressure, we'd have had the most awful shape. Thanks to computers by that stage, and Chris Williams at the Bath University in particular, we were able to manipulate the form. And it's, if you like, not quite a Frei Otto. He probably would have given us hell if he'd been involved. But I think rather elegant and beautiful. But to me, I thought that was really interesting, that this was starting to see, and I like to think I played a little part in helping Norman get into that kind of Frei framework with nature. And it led on to a set of projects, which I would say have sort of earmarked my career progress, and I just thought I'd share it with you. I'm standing up here talking to you. So Gateshead, my urge to get that shell form in, because I knew it was so light and efficient, covering some quite simple boxes, but creating a sense of presence on the river. After the British Museum, working in the States, a similar kind of problem, but different, wanting to get much stronger, better acoustic performance. So using depth of structure, not going for a three-way grid, but a two-way grid, using depth of structure to put a load of sound-absorbing material in, so that the quality of acoustics in that space is beautiful. You listen to a choir in that space, and it's perfect. So a different set of criteria, we were able to do different things. Norman saw, when he was working on the renovation of Dresden railway station, what if it was a membrane? You know, this is Germany, this is land of membrane structures. Let's throw away our ideas of the heavy solution and explore light. And so it was then, our job as engineers to say, how can we do this? What are the pros, what are the cons? But the lightness, by taking all the heavy weight of the roof off, meant that we could save all the old steel, which was rotting away over the last 100 years, and probably would have had to have been put in the bin. Certainly what they'd done in Leipzig station a year or two earlier. We managed to save, I like to think, that, in real sustainability solutions, save the steel by going for such a light fabric. I think the final one, just a few years ago, when Norman Foster was looking for how do I cover a gigantic space. In the end, we covered a slightly smaller space, but how do I cover a gigantic space with the kind of minimum of material? And having to think fairly quickly on my feet. Well, you could put in a load of props, you could put in a load of pressure, and you could just have a low one. But actually, in this context, you need something of a statement. So, back to the good old Fridays of the soap film. And resolving the high stresses at the top of the soap film, we came up with this form, and incredibly popular in Kazakhstan, where it was destined, because it's a kind of 21st century version of the yurt, and they kind of get there's a kind of resonance between the people and what happened there. It's a sort of taking their thinking into the new world. So just finally then. I was trying to bring out this idea that there's always this sense of the human experience in these buildings, and that's what Frei was looking for and very sensitive to. And I personally, I do think that that's something, I know in our practice, I'm absolutely convinced in many, many others, that human-centered design and that awareness of the impact that we're having on the individual and that ability to start to understand it and predict it better is something that engineers are looking to do alongside with architects. This idea now that we're creating these environments and we want to know about how we can benefit people with what we're doing, how we can play with light and create spaces that fill them with delight. And so I kind of feel that's what Frei was doing, and therefore, and it's taken me 40 years to kind of work this out, but it does make me feel very optimistic that we are taking Frei's thinking further and further forward about the kind of human center to our design. And in the practice, we like to say that, bringing this back to engineering, this isn't all about architecture. This is about, just as it was with Frei, is it engineering, is it architecture? It's neither really, but it's this harnessing of, we call it the engineering mind, because it's about evidence, it's about understanding our form, it's about understanding how we can predict the impact that form will have, not just on how the wind's going to blow, how it's going to be stable, but actually ultimately we're interested in how will it affect people emotionally when they're in there, and how can we tune it. So this harnessing of our magic, I think, is what Frei has helped us do. So it's really always brings it back, I think, to this amazing, quite quietly spoken, great fan of ballroom dancing man. You didn't know that one, maybe. He was pretty good. So I thought, thank you to Frei. He'd love to be here if he could be. But I think there's just plenty for us to do. Get busy. We've only just begun. He showed us the way. And now I hope the film will make us, will show us the way even more. Thank you.